can he change the Constitution? So can he change the way he's then elected? Can he change the way Congress works? Can he change the way legislation is passed?
And now, The Good Fight with Yascha Monk.
Welcome to a podcast that searches for the ideas, policies, and strategies that can beat authoritarian populists like Donald Trump over the next 4 years and the next 40. Europeans really hate Donald Trump, and for the best of reasons. They cannot stand his bragging, they cannot stand his open sort of racist appeals, they find him culturally repellent. But at some level, they also love Donald Trump. They love that Donald Trump reinforces every European prejudice about America, that he is the ugliest of Americans, that he encapsulates everything we've always wanted to look down upon in America. And that's understandable, but I think there's a danger here, because Europeans have not been as forthright and as clear in standing up to challenges to democracy as there might have been either. Just to name one example, Viktor Orban's party Fidesz is still a member of the European People's Party, the grouping of center-right parties in the European Parliament, to which, for example, Angela Merkel's Christian Democrats also belong. The real story of the last years is not about how ridiculous a figure Donald Trump is. It is the failure even of well-intentioned conservative elites in both Western Europe and North America to stand up to their principles. And so the European temptation to laugh at Donald Trump masks some of the ways in which the challenge we face on both sides of the Atlantic is actually quite similar. I'm really thrilled to have Anne Applebaum on the show today. Anne is a weekly columnist for Washington Post and a professor of practice at the London School of Economics. And she's written these two really influential books about the history of Central and Eastern Europe called Gulag, about the gulags and the terrible system of punishment in the Soviet Union and its Allied States, and The Iron Curtain, the crushing of Eastern Europe, about how the communists took over in Central and Eastern Europe. But she's reported on the transition towards democracy in Poland and other countries in 1989. She's worked on British politics and American politics, and she's been one of the most astute critics of Donald Trump from the beginning. We just had a great conversation about the threat of social media, about Vladimir Putin, about what to learn from how dictators have crushed democratic societies in the past, whether there's any parallels to the way in which the Soviets took over in Poland and Hungary in the late 40s and early 50s. We started the conversation with that. It's a fascinating topic, and I've just learned so much about how to think about this moment from that conversation. Welcome to the show, Anne. So I'll start with the first and sort of most obvious question, which is that, you've seen the fight against populism in many different countries, in many different contexts, and you've studied the takeover of authoritarian regimes historically. So what perspective does that give you on how Americans are doing at resisting Donald Trump? And is that even a useful set of comparison points, or is it the wrong way to think about it?
Well, first of all, you do have to be careful. And I try and constantly remind myself, that just because I have the 1940s in Eastern Europe in the back of my head, that doesn't mean this is the 1940s in Eastern Europe all the time. But actually looking at the techniques of democratic takeover, which is what happened, for example, in the countries of Eastern Europe after the Second World War. Although they weren't obviously democracies, they were destroyed societies. But the attempt is, maybe I should say, institutional takeover. How does a very determined ideological group, in that case backed by foreigners, take over the state? Understanding what it was that interested them the most and what were the institutions that were the most vulnerable actually does help if you want to understand how democracy could go wrong in a Western country. So we're not in that position. There hasn't been a massive war and there isn't a totalitarian front group trying to take over the United States. Nevertheless, looking at, for example, what were the most vulnerable institutions in Poland and Hungary and East Germany after the war does help you think a little bit about the United States. So
what were they? I mean, so you
Well, so
write
what
about
were
this a lot in Iron Curtain, the crushing of Eastern Europe, and
Right.
you really sort of take the reader in masterful detail through how the Soviet Union essentially managed to use local communist groups and so on to colonize those countries. And sort of in retrospect, it seems very obvious to us that, well, the Second World War ends and the countries in which the communist troops are sort of stationed end up being part of the Eastern Bloc and the others end up being part of the Western blocs, and this is all inevitable. But actually, these were societies that often had pseudo-free elections or free elections a couple of years after the war.
They had universities, and they had a tradition of free press, and they had what we would now call civil society. They had all kinds of voluntary institutions. They had private schools. They had churches. They had, in some cases, very powerful churches. There were a lot of things that should have stood in the way, and
So why didn't they?
Before we get back to the United States, which is obviously much different, you have to read my 450-page book for me to give you the whole story.
The point of you being on the podcast is that you just have to listen to this podcast and you learn all of those things.
No, but the institutions in the case of Eastern Europe were very weakened by the war and by the kind of blow to national confidence that the war created. I mean, once your society has been taken over and undermined, you have a lot less faith in its institutions and in its political elite. And it's, a lot of people said after the war, well, look, where did the so-called democratic elites or the national elites get us before the war? Nowhere. They led to this catastrophe. Why should we believe them this second time?
Right.
So that was a very, you had almost like a catastrophic loss of trust in the national elite. Again, nothing like what we're seeing anywhere in the West today, but that was one of the, that's an important thing to remember because loss of trust is, I think, part of the problem at the moment. You also had an economic catastrophe. People were very desperate for any kind of institutional stability, and so they would cling on to whatever there was. And so the Russians came in and set up institutions, and people joined them immediately because for example, they set up secret police units in each one of these countries, and people joined them because that was a source of money and power. Right away, you could have money and power having been oppressed by the Nazis for the previous 5 years, and that was very attractive to a lot of people for understandable reasons. So there are a lot of reasons why that happened. But it's also important to look at, one of the things I found interesting when writing that book was looking at what it was that both the Soviet Union and its kind of local communist partners, what did they think was important? Like, what did they do first when they got there? And it was slightly different than what I had expected. I looked a little bit randomly, and I started out thinking, well, they must have wanted to take over the newspapers.
Right.
And it turned out they weren't particularly interested in the newspapers. They were interested in the radio.
Right, because that's the mass media.
Because it was mass media. And it was the sort of internet of its time. In other words, they thought this is the way to speak to people directly. We're gonna
and the cable news of its time as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. And we're going to let the national intellectuals go on talking to each other, and they can publish their little papers and they can do whatever they want, but we're going to speak directly to the people, and therefore it's really, really important that we have control of the radio stations. And they did
just
that.
As a side
and they did.
note,
I mean, literally first when the Red Army came into East Berlin, it wasn't East Berlin. Sorry, when it was in Berlin. Literally on day 2, they take over the radio station.
Interesting.
And not only they take over the radio station, they immediately staff it with Germans who've been trained in Moscow during the war for that purpose, and they bring them over and put them in charge of the radio station. So that's like they're preparing for that in advance, and that's one of the things they thought about. Yeah. And so therefore, you see the importance of new forms of media and the importance of media that reaches the masses or reaches large numbers of people over the heads of the political class. And you can see, look, it's not just Donald Trump who figured this out, but lots of other politicians have figured out that that's what Twitter is. I mean, it's maybe not very efficient, and you don't reach as many people, and I think actually it's becoming discredited. But as an instinct, look, we don't want to be filtered by commentators. We don't want our message scrambled. We want to just speak directly to the people. We're going to do it on Twitter. That's a sort of. That was exactly the Red Army instinct after the Second World War.
So the first thing they did is to take over radios and mass media. What else did they do that surprised you? What else did they do that sort of in conversation with what might not be happening now?
Well, the other surprising thing was, and then there was one unsurprising thing, but the other surprising thing was they were incredibly interested in youth groups and young people. And they focused a lot of attention. For example, right after the war, there were these spontaneously organized, again, in Germany, sort of young Christian Democrats. In Poland, various various young church youth groups and so on. This was something they focused like a laser on these groups. They sought to break them up. They sought to undermine them, take them over, in some cases arrest the leaders and get rid of them. So focusing on young, because they sort of reckoned, all right, the old people are out and they're not going to, we'll never convert them and they're all religious, so forget it. But we're going to focus on, they were great believers and they were like the Jesuits. They believed that you can shape people's brains. If you just give them the right information and the right education, then they'll, you can mold them. People will be what you want them to be. And so that was, and again, it's kind of like there's the Red Army in Berlin, city destroyed, summer of 1945. And they're worrying about like kindergartens, because they care a lot about how young people are going to be educated. And that's something they care about immediately.
So, and then was one thing you expected, you said.
The one thing I expected was they were very interested in setting up the secret police.
Right.
And in sort of targeting the immediate enemies of the regime and eliminating them. So they were very interested in how do we get control over, and by secret police, I mean secret police actually maybe not even a great word. It was the political police. So creating a kind of alt police force that isn't not the guys who catch criminals, but a kind of political police force which is focused, which is directly loyal to the Communist Party and which is focused on controlling the Communist Party's enemies. And that they do that before they get there. They start working on that in the late 30s. They start creating the basis of what would be the Polish, Hungarian, Czech, East German secret police forces are created in 1940, 5 years before they arrive.
Fascinating. So just thinking out loud here, it seems like there are some parallels, but on the whole, this sort of actually, I think, reassures me about the situation we're in, right?
Yes.
Because there's not, the Trump kindergarten. There was Trump University once upon a time, but that wasn't very political, ideological.
And it wasn't a great success either.
And it was a great success. There's not the Trump kindergarten. Of course, they are trying to colonize media and public space in certain ways, and using Twitter to their effect, certainly allying themselves, not just with new websites like Breitbart, but also increasingly taking over organizations like Fox News. But it's certainly not the complete control of them.
No, they don't have that aim. I mean, the thing to watch out for is, you have to think, what are the modern versions of these things? David Frum has written very well about this. So in the 1930s and again in the 1940s, in the communist era, you had, in the Nazi era, you had brown shirts. In the Soviet era, you had these kind of thugs who became secret policemen who were, often came from the criminal world, who were used to intimidate people. So what's the modern equivalent of that? I mean, maybe it's not going to look the same. Right. Maybe it would be intimidating people online, or maybe it would be intimidating people in particular communities. When I saw his rallies during the election, I found those very creepy, because the idea of the violent mass rally that inspires, that makes people sort of angry, and that's an old tactic, and it comes back to the 30s and 40s and 50s. You also saw it very recently used in Ukraine. I mean, you can see it in other countries. So that's a sort of familiar and known tactic. And the question is then, is there an online version of that? Are there ways in which they can try and intimidate people online? I mean, I don't see right now that Trump or his administration is well organized enough to think any of this stuff through. But
the thing about Trump seems to be that he's an authoritarian by instinct, 100%, but by ideology, sort of 5%. I mean,
you have to know what you're doing. If you want to take over the state, you have to have a plan to take over the state. You have to go institution by institution, and you have to. I mean, it's. And you've seen it done in other countries. I mean, it was done in Venezuela. There's a government trying to do it now in Poland, who I think will fail, actually. But I mean, you have to take aim at each one, and he hasn't really shown the capacity to do that.
So I think that there's this sort of incredible veering from optimism to pessimism in America over the last months. 10 days into Trump's administration, people were freaked out, right? I mean, there was the inaugural speech, which reportedly George W. Bush had called some weird shit. There was the first executive orders, and people really felt like Bannon is in charge of this. He knows what he's doing, and it's just going to get out of control. And then things sort of calmed down for a little bit. And around the 100-day mark, I know because I was asked to write for a few places, the 100-day summary, and everybody was saying, oh, it's fine, and the administration has mellowed, we're resisting successfully, don't worry about it. And then the firing of Comey happened, speculation about possibly firing Mueller and so on, and suddenly it's sort of back to, oh my God, he's taking over the state. And what I'm struck by when I think about certainly opinion outside of those countries, American view of what was happening in Russia in the early 2000s, the American view of what was happening in Turkey throughout the 2000s, is that we sort of, actually for a long time, were reassured by things. These people were not saying openly we're destroying democracy. Erdogan was celebrated as a great Democrat.
And he
one
was. He was
American
elected.
president after another thought we can do business with Putin. He's not so bad, internationally certainly, but even domestically, So is it because we were naive and we just thought we live in this age that's inexorably moving towards democracy and we don't have to worry about those things now? And it might be a case of overcorrecting if we suddenly think, Trump doesn't seem to be destroying the system. Let's not worry too much. And say, no, actually we have to worry because look at those other countries. Or is that a real lesson to take away from those? That you only recognize the pattern over time and that the main agents may not even know what they're doing. But Orban, when he took power, may not have known exactly the degree to which he wants to destroy democracy in Hungary. It's sort of year after year, new things happen and it takes on a dynamic of its own. And that's where you wind up going.
Well, in the case of Putin, if you look at Putin and Erdogan and Orban, you're absolutely right. In all three of those cases, you had people who came to power democratically and who then changed the system, either in order to stay in power or in order to alter it fundamentally so that a decade later they weren't democracies anymore. In each one of those cases, you had the ability in practice. I mean, in Hungary, it was in reality, but you had the ability to effectively change the constitution. And so the really turning point with Trump, and we aren't even close to that yet, is can he change the Constitution? So can he change the way he's then elected? Can he change the way the Congress works? Can he change the way legislation is passed? And I don't have the sense that he has that kind of, certainly he himself doesn't have that kind of legal understanding or strategic thinking. But, if there are people around him who do, we haven't heard from them yet. I mean, So far, his attempts to undermine institutions mostly involve blocking them. I mean, for example, what has been done to the State Department, which is simply to abandon it. Don't use it, don't talk to it, don't appoint people. Run American foreign policy out of the White House or out of Jared Kushner's office or out of Mattis's office. It's not really clear right now how it's being run. And so
it may not be being run at all.
It may not be being run at all, as we've just seen the last couple of days. But so you can see him. You can see how you could abandon an institution, or what's been done to healthcare. You just make it more and more difficult for insurance companies to cooperate. You block this piece of it or that piece of it, and sooner or later, a year from now, it's just not going to work anymore. And you can see that how they could do that across a whole range of institutions in the United States. What I don't see yet is how he, ensures that he's reelected without competition, for example, as Orban does, or that he passes a referendum giving him extra powers, as Erdogan did, or that he changes the law so that he can, have a third term and a fourth term like Putin did. I don't see that yet.
At Qualcomm, we believe in staying connected, and you can see us wherever 5G is helping transform telemedicine, supporting remote education, and powering mobile PCs. The invention age is here. Learn more at qualcomm.com/inventionage.
So I agree that that's the bit I'm most optimistic about as well for two reasons. The first, that you do need a little bit of strategic capacity and imagination in order to subvert a state. Even Orban and Erdogan and Putin, who may not have had a very clear idea of needing to destroy democracy to serve their aims when they came into office, from the beginning systematically tried to co-opt state institutions by filling them with their own cronies, by getting rid of enemies and so on. And for me, the clearest sign that Trump is not doing that, not I think because he's too decent to do it, but simply because he doesn't understand the necessity of doing it for what I do take at some level, at some inchoate level to be his goals, was the appointment of Neil Gorsuch. So he has an opportunity to fill a seat on the Supreme Court with somebody And he goes for somebody who, helps Republicans probably accomplish a lot of their policy goals, but who also, by all we know, is, a consummate jurist who certainly cares deeply about the Constitution and is not going to bend it out of shape in order to serve Trump. That seems, from the point of view of an authoritarian playbook, like a clear missed opportunity. But there's also a broader question here about whether or not, to what degree the rules of the game matter. And political scientists always want to say that they matter completely for sort of boring reasons. I mean, essentially, there was a couple of decades in political science where nobody thought about institutions. So every prominent political scientist today sort of cut their teeth as a grad student rebelling against that and saying, no, it's all about institutions. And so all political scientists think it's all about institutions. And I tend to think often that is not so much about institutions, because you see populist parties rising and doing well in all of these different systems that really differ from each other substantively. But here, perhaps it is a story of institutions, right? So what would have to happen in order to change the constitution and really weaken the ability of the opposition to run an effective campaign in 2020? Well, first of all, you might want to colonize the electoral commission, as Orban did in Hungary. But there's not one electoral commission. There's not even 50 electoral commissions. It's a whole set of
and
state
some of them
officials,
are run on
county
shoestring,
officials, right? I mean, that is a tremendous logistical nightmare trying to influence and change that. And there's certainly no indication that in any systematic way Trump is doing that. And the same for the actual constitution, right? I mean, in many countries, it's enough to have 2/3 majority in parliament, often even a lower majority in parliament, and you can change really how elections are carried out in a very substantive way. Here, some of how elections are carried out is decided at the state level, and changing the US Constitution is an incredibly complicated thing for which you need an incredibly broad coalition. So that seems like a positive sign as well, right?
No, those are very positive. I mean, the one thing to look at that also links both Orban, Erdogan, and Putin was what they did to the media, because none of them actually did censorship. And the modern, and this is where we begin to part rather rapidly from my 1940s model, but modern authoritarianism, or sort of modern, sort of light authoritarianism of the kind that those countries represent, you don't have censorship. Instead, what you do is you undermine the business model of newspapers that you don't like, or you make sure that people who advertise in newspapers or television programs that you don't like have trouble.
Yeah.
So this is, and this is something that Orban absolutely did. So the idea was to eliminate the opposition newspapers by basically saying to anybody who advertises in them doesn't get government contracts. And this, of course, is something that's much easier to do in a small European country where lots of businesses, one way or the other, even if they're private, are dependent on the government, and much harder to do in the United States. Although you could imagine, I mean, if you look at ownership of CNN or ownership of some of the larger, broadcasting organizations in the United States, you can imagine an attempt to intimidate them. You can sort of play out how that might work. That's a modern technique.
I mean, obviously, in Eastern Europe after World War II, very quickly, there was very heavy censorship of every publication. But in the beginning, as you were saying, people were interested in radio, but not in the newspaper, they let people talk to each other. And there's certainly an equivalent of that in a lot of populist regimes now, right?
The equivalent is we allow, in Russia, I mean, you allow the intellectuals to have 3 or 4 little newspapers or websites, and you just make sure they get nowhere near television.
Right.
And that's essentially, the state controls television, and you can talk about anything you want as long as not too many people hear it. And that's the
as long as you have a literary journal where you speak to your 10,000 people back and forth, and the sort of critical intellectuals can feel like they're doing something, but talking to each other.
Right, but it doesn't actually affect most people. Another similar tactic to that is eliminating sort of cultural institutions that harbor people who you suspect don't like you. So you shut down funding for contemporary art.
Right.
Or you shut down funding for universities. This is absolutely a Russian, Hungarian, Turkish tactic. So even though you can't identify the people at the Central European University who are against you, you just know in general you dislike places where there's lots of open conversation and debate, and so you try and defund them, or you make them you cut off their legal standing or something like that. So that's also attacking. That's another one also that I would find hard to see how you would replicate here, except of course in the small ways that the government can do it, for example, by cutting off arts funding, which there is some intention of doing.
Yeah, and that's happening for, of course, and there perhaps again, actually, America is so much less reliant on the government than other
Yep.
countries, right? I mean,
Yep.
even in a country like Germany, such a vast share of spending on arts and culture is through government funding.
Yep.
But if you really used that as a lever to change national culture and discourse, it would have a huge impact.
Yep.
Whereas in America, you shut down the National Endowment for the Arts, you defund it, as the Trump administration is planning to do. It certainly affects a lot of worthy artistic causes and so on, but it doesn't change the nature of a cultural conversation.
You don't
in
shut down the
America, right?
Metropolitan Museum of Art. You don't shut. I mean, there are lots of things you don't shut down. I mean, paradoxically, that what you would shut down with the National Endowment is you would mostly shut down the sort of rural and provincial and local programs that they do.
Interesting, yeah.
And that's actually a lot of their state-funded money goes into little cultural festivals in small places that don't have alternate sources of funding. So you would be
Goldman Sachs
actually
is not going to donate a lot of money to a little cultural
no.
center.
So the Met
London,
will be
Virginia.
fine, and the San Francisco Opera will be fine, but lots of rural and small town cultural organizations will not be. So that would be the effect of that.
So we've talked a lot about Putin and Russia, but more sort of as a model for how domestically societies get taken over by authoritarian populists. And we haven't talked so much about the threat that some of those countries now pose in themselves to Western liberal societies. So I want to get into that a little bit, because I know that you've been thinking for a very long time about the threat that Putin poses to democracies both in Central Europe and in Western Europe and North America. And I've been thinking, in preparing this conversation, that perhaps we don't distinguish enough between slightly different kinds of threats from countries like Russia, right? So the first is the threat that Putin poses directly to established democracies in the West, whether it's through hacking the DNC email servers and things like that, and trying to influence the election, trying to undermine trust in the election, and perhaps to some degree, potentially a military threat he poses. Right. The second is the threat that Putin poses to fledgling democracies, or even just independent states, in Central and Eastern Europe. Right. So the way in which he has annexed part of Ukraine's territory, the way in which he's trying to make it impossible for Ukraine to be a successful, thriving society anchored in the West, and so on. But then the third, which actually strikes me as in some ways most important and least talked about, is the threat that the kinds of methods that he's pioneering and using could pose in the coming decades, whoever they're wielded by. Right? I mean, not just by Russia, which is in many ways a declining power, but by China and other authoritarian governments that might want to hack into our elections and undermine trust in our system and subvert what we're doing. So which of these three things are you actually most worried about? Or how do we, do you think they're obviously all part of a package, but is it helpful to distinguish between those at all?
So it's helpful to distinguish between them in looking at their impact. And actually one of the things that's very important to understand about, particularly about Russian information warfare, for lack of a better, Russian disinformation, is that it's very tailored to particular places. So the kinds of groups and people it supports in France are very different from the kinds of groups and people it supports in Ukraine. I mean, it looks for weak sides of democratic societies and pushes on them. So it funds it's happy to fund the far right. They're happy to fund the far left. They're also very happy to work with corrupt groups and companies everywhere. So that's
and often in the same country, we're supporting far left and far right parties at the same time.
Absolutely.
Right?
I mean, one of the jokes about the French election was that of the four final candidates, and I can't prove this and wouldn't write it, but supposedly three of the four had Russian links of various kinds, and that's the far left, the far right, and the kind of business-friendly center right. And then the ones who won was the one. Macron was the one who didn't have any, which actually tells you something about effectiveness, but that's another.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think it actually also puts in context or in perspective some of the triumphalism around Macron's victory. I mean, I'm heartened by his victory, and it was quite decisive in the second round. But the fact of the matter is that in the first round of a presidential poll, over 70% of the vote went to candidates who had a very, very soft line on Russia.
Yes.
And in some ways, we came out lucky that the one who wasn't ended up winning.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's true. No, but returning to your original point, I think it is important to focus on, but what I was going to say, it's important to focus on what are the real effects in each country, because, some of the, not get too hung up on who's a mature democracy and who's an immature democracy and so on, because actually the tactics are often the same. It's always just a question of, which countries are more susceptible because of the nature of their societies. And generally speaking, the Russians do better in more corrupt societies because they find more people they can buy and more people they can work with than they do in...
And also might have a much easier path convincing people that they can't trust anything.
Yeah, and that exactly. That the state is weak, and it doesn't represent you, and it's corrupt. I mean, so it's essentially they do well in corrupt societies. In fact, I think the reason we should, this is another topic to discuss a little bit later, maybe, but I think one of the reasons they've done well in the United States is the suspicion that many people have the United States is corrupt in many ways. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that they use.
I know I'm sort of derailing you, but I think that's absolutely right, that the reason why they could succeed in America is that people had such low trust in the electoral system in the first place, such low trust in political parties in the first place, and that they have lost a certain amount of faith in democratic institutions and even the importance of democracy. And one of the ways of thinking about how to confront this threat domestically within our societies is not just, making sure that political campaigns have better IT security so that they can't hack into our email servers. It's not just, trying to retaliate more clearly when things like that happen so that foreign powers have less of a incentive for doing those kinds of shenanigans, just getting away with them scot-free as they have done so far. But it is also actually fortifying the intellectual defenses, the political defense that our own citizens have against being taken in by those kinds of things.
Also, I mean, the word I'd like to use is oligarchy. People suspect, and this is, by the way, one of the things that unites Britain and America right now, and partly explains why the politics of the U.S. and the U.K. are so messed up, whereas they're relatively less messed up in some other places. People have the sense that there is this, in the last decade, this class of very rich people has been created. Yeah. They have an undue influence on politics, on the economy, on everything else. Of course, they have people suspected, and of course, there is such a thing. It has this oligarchy has all kinds of links to oligarchs in other countries, in China and in Russia. And it acts more in its own interests than it does in the interests of the country. I mean, the most important link between Trump and Russia is simply that Trump feels at home in Russia. He admires he admires the Russian oligarchs. He wants to be like them. He shares a sensibility. They invest in his properties.
His living room looks like their living rooms.
His living room looks like it could belong to one of them. His daughter socializes with them. Roman Abramovich's wife is a friend of Ivanka's. It's They move in the same spheres, and they have the same set of values. I mean, that's the biggest scandal about him of all.
Right. But and that's true more broadly, right? I mean, there's a story to be told about some secret dealings that Trump has with the Philippines, and that's why he endorses somebody quite as ghastly as Rodrigo Duterte. But that's clearly not true, and I don't know whether that is reassuring or makes me even more scared. The point of the matter is that he genuinely admires the president of a country who says, just kill all the drug dealers or anybody who might possibly in any way look like a drug dealer. And Trump sees that and thinks, that's great.
Yeah, no, that's true. But to return to your point about other countries using these methods, I mean, this is absolutely true, and it's already started. And the only reason that the Russians are first is because the Russians are much more sophisticated about the West. They care about the West. They study the West.
And they have many decades of experience.
Of trying to do exactly this, undermine democracy. The fact is now they've got better at using, Facebook and Twitter in order to do it, but they've been doing it for many years. And they have, and they understand it, they get it. I mean, the Chinese, I don't think, do understand the West to anything like that level, and certainly not the Iranians. But is there a possibility that others will use methods like this in the future? Yes, absolutely. If they're not used in the U.S., they'll be used elsewhere. I mean, China's natural area where it might begin to try and influence democratic politics is probably Southeast Asia, not Europe.
Right.
But the tactics are there, the possibilities are out there, and now everybody can use them. I mean, not only that, American groups can use them. I mean, you can, there's a good argument that says that the way that Fox operates now and this was not always true of Fox, actually, Fox News, is a lot the way that RT, the Russia Today, operates. It's very similar tactics. Some of it, so it looks most of the time like a normal television station. They have some good journalists there. And then they have conspiracy theorists who occasionally appear to bring the conspiracy theories into the mainstream. That's what RT does. And that's exactly how it works. And so there's an argument. I don't know who learned from who, actually. It may have been that RT.
Oh, that's fascinating.
It may be that RT learned from Fox rather than vice versa. But the point is that understanding how these tactics work, anybody can do it.
So what do we do about them? How do we respond? I feel like there's sort of a slightly unfruitful policy debate, even more strongly outside the United States, because there's not the First Amendment, but to some degree from the United States as well, where sort of on the one side, politicians standing up and saying, well, Facebook and Twitter just has to censor everything that's racist or that's fake news, and we just, need to go and make Silicon Valley, comply with our political wishes and demands. And then on the other side, there's sort of people saying, well, no, that would completely destroy freedom of speech, and there's nothing we can do, and we should just sort of leave these platforms as they are. And my hunch is that there's something in between.
There are things in between. I think the difficulty with this issue, and by the way, I don't know if you ever want to circle back to the original conversation, but this, by the way, I think is, you ask why is there populism everywhere now all at once? Is it to do with the institution? I really think it's actually to do with the internet and the nature of news and the nature of the way in which people now get and process political information. But the problem
I do want to circle back on that. Just after your answer.
That's because that's what I think it is. But the point is that, there isn't, in no country is there going to be a single institution or person whose responsibility it is to deal with this. And the response it's a very unsatisfactory response. I actually described it to a 19-year-old yesterday who laughed at me. He said, that's not interesting. But the response is going to have to be multiple. Like there will be several dozen responses. Like the response will be media literacy programs, and it will be disinformation tracking programs, and it will be political movements which seek to control the oligarchy. It will be a kind of the best and strongest response to this change in the way that people are getting news is going to come from, again, what we call civil society, but means journalists, activists, political parties, ordinary people spending time learning how Facebook works. I think that ultimately has to be the response. You aren't going to get a silver bullet. There isn't going to be one regulation or one solution. And I think, the various platforms are responding in different ways. They all are now aware of this kind of problem. And it may be that in order to avoid regulation, they begin to think about ways of dealing with it.
That seems right. I think Silicon Valley was feted for so long and saw itself as the good guy for so long that they haven't quite understood how dangerous a real political backlash against them might be.
Yes.
And I think they're slowly starting to understand that, and that's going to increase their willingness to do something.
Yes.
This is only a small piece of a puzzle, and I'm really persuaded by your multi-pronged approach. But
it's an unsatisfying thing to describe, though. It's if you want
it's always easier to say here's
right
the silver bullet.
I think there are going to be about 12 answers, and they're going to come from about 15 different kinds of organizations and social groups. And they're going to involve everything from schools to online hackers organizations to it's going to be a huge range of.
I agree, and just one thought about sort of Facebook, which people have talked about a lot, and which certainly is, I think, now the biggest purveyor of political news. I think instead of Facebook either having to track every piece of fake news and censor it, you cannot tell your friends something you believe to be true because it's a conspiracy theory, on the one side. And just saying, oh, look, we're completely neutral and let everything happen on the other side. There is the approach of saying, okay, we will try and monitor the most viral stories, the stories that are spreading most quickly, that are having the biggest impact. And we will investigate those. And when we see that, there's a conspiracy theory about a child sex ring in the basement of a DC pizza restaurant, which is clearly untrue, then we change the algorithm, or we activate sort of a fake news part of the algorithm in such a way that, yes, you're allowed to share that with your 50 friends, but it's not going to be coming up on the top of news feeds. It's not going to be one of the viral stories on the sort of top right of the screen and so on.
Yeah,
So there's ways sort of in between censoring what you can say to your actual group of friends and allowing fake news to just become completely rampantly viral on Facebook.
Yeah,
But
I mean, there are a lot of people right now that some of whom I've spoken to in the last few days, actually. There are a lot of people now looking for almost kind of mechanical or artificial intelligence answers. Like, could you identify fake news? Could a machine do it? Because first of all, having humans do it creates this appearance of censorship, and second of all, you need something that works at scale. And so there are a lot of people now looking at, could you at least, for example, if a story comes up, could there be some kind of automatic ranking that it gets according to all different kinds of, its source, the kind of language it uses? I mean, there would be ways of measuring it. And so lots of people are working on that. I mean, I don't think that's ever going to solve the problem completely, but it might be that eventually you could get a little ranking, which of course would be disputable, that would give you some information about a story or a piece of...
Or it might lead the alt-right to suddenly use lots of complicated terms in the articles to up-rank.
There's already an example of that, which is that somebody has created a... you can apparently do, again, it's a sort of machine learning AI program that will tell you whether a particular article is particularly hate-filled. You can measure that. And then it turns out that the way to get around that is, instead of using the word, instead of using anti-Semitic language, you insert the word fuzzy bunnies or something instead of Jews, and then, then you mess up the algorithm. So it's people will figure out how to get around that.
We need algorithms that also penalize hatred of fuzzy bunnies.
Exactly. And then you go into a weird rabbit hole and never come out. I mean,
quite literally a rabbit hole. Just to get back to the thing that you wanted to come back to. So Eastern Europe is a puzzle to me in one specific respect, which is that I'm trying in the book that I'm writing, more or less finished, to give a broad account of the causes of populism, precisely because I think people, say in America, just look at recent American developments, and so they're tempted to come up with a bunch of explanations that are specific to this society. But then you see similar phenomena in other countries, and the specific causes aren't there, so it's got to be something else. And Eastern Europe poses a puzzle to me, because it seems to me that when you look at Western Europe, North America, even a lot of countries in Asia that have experienced populism, two things are true. The first is a real stagnation in the living standard of average people. I've said this before in this podcast. In the States, from 1935 to 1960, living standard of the average American doubles. From 60 to 85, it doubles again. Since 85, it's been stagnant. And the second is, dealing with rapid increase in immigration, in the number of foreign-born people in your country, the sort of struggle to build an equal multi-ethnic society. Now, in places like Poland or Hungary, both of those reasons don't really seem to apply in a straightforward way. Poland has done phenomenally well economically since the late 80s, when you were there reporting on the transition from communism to democracy, right? The average Pole has increased the living standard by really quite remarkable amounts. And there's not that much immigration. So what does that say?
There's no immigration.
Right. So what does that say about... does that mean that the story in Central and Eastern Europe is just a little different? Or does that mean that actually all of this has nothing to do with economic stagnation? It has nothing to do with immigration?
So I think the role of both economic stagnation and immigration are both overplayed by quite a lot. What matters a lot is it's not just what is real to people, like is there any real immigration, or even is there any real economic threat? A lot of it's to do with perceptions. And if you live, in an online world where you're constantly bombarded by images of, Muslim terror attacks in Brussels, you begin to, you can fear immigration even if you don't know any immigrants. Mm-hmm. So, you have to be very careful about, a lot of this is perceptions. I mean, I accept that there's real economic stagnation as well, but there's also, you also have in Eastern Europe, for example, the phenomenon of, okay, you now have a new generation. So people who are my age, people who are in their 40s or 50s, have a memory, of this incredible gain in living standards, total transformation of the last 2 decades. People who are 20 don't remember that.
Right.
And they don't compare themselves to their parents or grandparents. They compare themselves to their contemporaries in Germany or France. And why aren't we as rich as them? And so you can also get dissatisfaction by cross-comparison to similar nearby societies, people become very impatient. So all
That seems to me to be-
there's a perceived, there's a perception that we aren't doing well by comparison to our people in Germany, even though we are doing well by comparison to our grandparents.
But so you see, this is the tack that I'm tempted to take. But I thought that perhaps you were sort of more critical of that, right? So it seems to me that yes, the story that works everywhere else doesn't easily work in places like Poland, but a subtler version of it does, right? So you think about economics, and it's like, well, it's true that their economic standard of living has hugely increased over the last 30 years. But they also say, you know what, a lot of the people in our society who've done really well are sort of the wrong people. It's not as bad in Poland as in some other places in Central and Eastern Europe, but it's sort of the old communist elites in a lot of places.
Which is actually not even true in Poland. But yeah.
Right, in Poland that's true. But
although people do believe that.
Right. Who have done really well, right? So the wrong people did the best out of it. And I was told that once we come out of communism, we're going to have a standard of living of Germany and Spain and so on. But you know what? I still do earn a lot less than them. Even if I've gone and gotten a decent college degree, I still have reason to go and live in London as a barista or working in Starbucks, because actually those are still the best options I have for a lot of people, right? And so, and there's, I think, a real fear of the future that Poles and Hungarians and so on share with people. And I've done all right. It's true that I have a lot more than my parents, but I really fear for my children, right?
Yeah. Generally speaking, I don't think Eastern Europe is very different from Western Europe anymore. I don't think they're kind of civilizationally different. I don't think the differences are nuance rather than being profound. I mean, remember, they've been part of the same various clubs for 20 years. But the one thing I would say is do pay attention to, because when some of this started, so the worst waves of dissatisfaction start in the last sort of 5 or 6 years in almost everywhere.
Yeah.
And it does coincide with more and more people getting their political news from social media.
Interesting. Yeah.
And that's the one actually thing that is constant, not only across Europe, but around the world.
Yeah.
I mean, what is the Asian society that is most most addicted to or uses most often Facebook? It's the Philippines. And so there is a way in which, and what does social media do? By the way, I'm not blaming social media for everything. I'm just saying it does change the way in which people start thinking and talking about politics.
Yeah.
And one of the things that it does is that it undermines the authority of traditional parties, and allows people to organize in different ways. And that can be very good or it can be very bad. I mean, it's actually politically neutral.
I agree completely, yeah.
It can be very good in the Arab Spring or it can be very bad in the... So people have alternate ways of organizing, and they find different communities online. And one of the things that does is that very, very rapidly it turns out that the old political parties no longer represent anything real. So what's the old political division in Europe? It's Christian in most European Christian Democrats whose social base was in the church, versus the sort of socialist center left whose basis is in the trade unions. Well, guess what? Neither the trade unions nor the church is very influential anymore. People are finding, they identify with one another in different ways, and they organize around different issues. And the mainstream political parties don't represent that. And so people don't see in politics, and they don't see on the sort of, at the top of the political ladder, people or parties are the causes that they care about. And I think, and that's so that's not to say that Facebook has, done something evil, but it has, by its existence, it's sort of disorganized politics. And in a few places, I mean, I think this is why Macron was able to take advantage of this. In some places, politicians have been able to adjust and take advantage of these new, people's new identities and new ways of identifying. In other places, they haven't been able to, like, for example, in the UK. And I think, by the way, the UK and the US are where it's most difficult for parties to change and where it's most difficult for new parties to emerge because of the nature of the voting systems. So that's why it could be that European countries find it easier to adjust. So I hope that wasn't too complicated.
No, not at all. I mean, I agree completely that social media is neutral in one sense, not neutral at all in another sense. I think it's neutral between left and right. It can be mobilized by Trump or by Macron.
Yeah, or Obama, yeah.
Right, or by Obama or by Podemos. I mean, I think in that sense it's neutral. I do think it systematically reduces the advantage that political elites have over outsiders. But it used to be that political elites and financial elites just had access to a set of resources that most people in the society didn't.
Yep.
It was one-to-many communication where if you had access, you were the government and you were a set of people who controlled the New York Times and, NBC and so on, you could determine what was part of a political discourse and what wasn't part of a political discourse. And that ability to control and narrow the bounds of debate has completely been blown out in the last years.
Yep.
Now, in some countries where actually what was allowed was relatively broad and what wasn't allowed was mostly sort of racism and anti-democratic sentiment and so on, that actually has pretty scary effects. In other countries, especially authoritarian regimes, I think it might still be favoring the democratic opposition because the dictator now has less of a technological advantage. And so it is neutral between left and right. It's neutral even between pro-democrats and anti-democrats. The way in which it's not neutral is that I think it systematically favors instability and change over stability and continuity.
Yeah, so this is another point that the people have got sort of also, this is a more broader sort of phenomenon connected to the internet. It's not just social media, which is that people have become accustomed to things happening very fast.
Yeah.
So you can press a button and you can get, a book delivered to your house the next day, or you can press a button and indicate your likes for somebody or some cause, and you can sort of therefore feel a little burst of whatever hormone it is that makes you happy, because you've done something. You can donate money in 1 second. You can, all these things you can do very fast. Democratic politics is incredibly slow, and it involves coalition building.
Yep.
And, when it works, it often involves deal doing, and sometimes deals that have to be negotiated behind the scenes or non-transparently in order for them to work. And so there is a frustration with democracy because it seems to work so much worse than everything else. So why is it that, in my life, I can do all this stuff really fast and everything's really easy, and then I look at politics and everything's incredibly slow and stagnant.
Right. Once every 4 or 5 years, I get to go to a polling booth, make a choice between 3 different options.
Inefficient. And then you have, the phenomenon of something you've had, always, which is that then some people come along and say, right, I can do this all really fast and I can make it better really quickly. And, which is essentially what Trump did. And
the promise of simplicity is at the heart of
the promise of simplicity. There was
anybody who tells you that politics is complicated is lying to you. They're just self-serving.
Right.
Actually, it's all simple.
Right.
And once I'm elected, I'll
right. And that's always, there's always been an appeal to that, but I just think there's a particular appeal to it right now, when everything else seems to be move so quickly and politics seems to move so slowly. And so that's why you've had the increased appeal of that kind of language. I can fix it. It can be done quickly. We can just wipe away all this detritus. So many things. Think about how many things are being wiped away and eliminated, all the time now so quickly. I mean, it may we may be the end of retailing. May happen in the next 10 years, and shops may disappear. And we've already seen the disappearance of of all kinds of other things. And so the appeal of a politician who says, look, everything else is disappearing. Why don't I just wipe out all this old stuff about constitutions and boring courts? And, you can hear that in Trump's language, actually, quite a lot.
You could get a counter reaction to it, right? You could get politicians who say, a public mood where it's like, no, I hate that the shops are disappearing. I hate that all of this is changing. Perhaps suddenly, a political promise for slowing change might become attractive. At the moment, that's not the case. At the moment, even centrists who win, like Macron, are candidates of change. That's the centrists who've done well. In some ways, there was Obama. I mean, Obama was never that radical politically. He was always in some ways relatively centrist. But the rhetoric was obviously all about change. I want to pick up on a sort of half sentence you said earlier and broaden that out to the last question, which is you were saying that actually Poland was doing relatively well, and not doing relatively well, but you were optimistic about democracy surviving in Poland despite the sort of attempt by the current government to go on down the Hungarian and so on model. I mean, more broadly, across all of the different countries that you have such a deep understanding of in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, in North America, are we sitting through a thriller that'll have a happy end? Or do we have to expect the worst? Will democracy survive this dangerous moment and rear its head triumphant? Or do you think that the democratic world will be significantly curtailed 20 or 30 years from now?
Some of it depends on events and depends on things that happen outside the democratic world. I mean, if there is a war with Russia, which I still don't discount, then that will alter the balance of power, and that will change the way people see Europe and understand NATO and understand the role of the United States. So there are all kinds of things that are going to happen that we can't predict right now that will affect that. I mean, I think generally speaking, it's true that the attack on democracy can produce a kind of counter, whether you call it a resistance or whether you call it a counter movement or whether you call it something reinvigorating, which could be healthy. You could imagine, certainly in the United States, you could imagine, and certainly in Eastern Europe and certainly in Britain, you could imagine a movement to renew institutions, which would be, incredibly positive. A lot of the question is just, do we get to that point before there's a war or before there's, before there's some kind of tragedy, associated with the current situation. And in my more optimistic moods, I think, we'll get through this. And then sometimes I worry that we may see a crisis, in the next year or two that will prevent it. But
so basically 90% chance of things turning out pretty well and 10% chance of things turning out absolutely catastrophically. I didn't want to put numbers in your mouth. But, thank you so much. This is a really wonderful and enlightening conversation. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Questions.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of A Good Fight. Lots of listeners have been spreading the word about this show. If you too have been enjoying this podcast, please be like them. Rate the show on iTunes, tell your friends all about it, share it on Facebook or Twitter, paint a giant mural of me and all of my past guests in your neighborhood. And finally, please mail suggestions for great guests or comments about the show to thegoodfight@newamerica.org.
Thank you for listening to this podcast from New America. This recording carries a Creative Commons 4.0 international license. Thanks to Silent Partner for their song, Chess Pieces. To learn more about New America, please visit newamerica.org.